Welcome to this session. It's on. And we're recording. Good. So it's a session for the battle for the classrooms, education or indoctrination. I'm Ruth Mierspüler. I'm a lecturer in education studies, and I'll be chairing the session today. In the 1960s, philosophers of education, philosophers like Peters, Hurst, White, and Passmore, they were quite clear about the distinction between education and indoctrination. And I'd just like to read a quote from John Passmore, a philosopher of education, who has written quite a neat description of it in a book published in 1967, The Concept of Education. So he says, there is a fundamental difference between the educator and the indoctrinator. The indoctrinator treats what he takes to be a fact, a principle, or a person or work he describes to be admired as beyond the reach of rational criticism. The educator, on the other hand, welcomes criticism and is prepared to admit that he does not always know the answer to them. So it's curious that in the 1960s, philosophers of education seemed quite clear about the distinction between education and indoctrination, something which perhaps we have lost today. That's why we're having the discussion with an absolute fantastic panel here, which I will introduce in the order they're going to speak. So we will start with Penny Lewis on my far left. Penny is a lecturer at the University of Dundee, and she has also links with the University of Wuhan in China, so just come back recently from China as well. She's an author of a number of books, but importantly for the session today, Penny is actively involved in the Scottish Union for Education, which promotes subject-based education. Second is Agnes Snow, on my left here. Agnes is an art student at the University of Manchester Metropolitan University. Besides studying, Agnes also creates comic strips. And her strips are, she's just got a sample of her first book out here, on her experiences studying art in Manchester. So look out for the publication. It's going to be out soon, and you will want to definitely have a look at that. Third will be Dr. Ruth Wareham. Ruth is a lecturer of philosophy of education at the University of Birmingham. She has a background in teaching, primary school teaching in Birmingham, and she is currently writing a book called Do Faith School Have a Place in Liberal Democracies? And last but not least, to my far right, we have Clive Wright. Clive is the principal of St. Martin's Catholic Academy in Stoke Golding in Leicestershire. He spent much of his career teaching and leading schools in and around Birmingham. Clive is also the founder of the Knowledge School Hub, which is a network for schools to develop knowledge-rich curriculum and train hundreds of school leaders every year to improve the behavior and content of what is being taught in schools as well. So can we give the panel a warm welcome, please? We'll start off with Penny, and after the 5 minutes each, go out straight to the audience for questions and comments. Penny, please.
I'm just going to tell you a bit about the Scottish Union for Education. There's been quite a bit of interest in our stall, but please come and visit afterwards. We're a year old. We had a conference that was supported by the Battle of Ideas in Glasgow in November, exactly November a year ago. And it was attended by For Women Scotland, which is a feminist organisation that's led the campaign against the gender recognition reforms. The Glasgow Cabbie, who's a cabbie, who has raised a lot of funds to challenge some of the sex education content of the curriculum in Scotland. The Scottish Family Party, that's a Christian organisation, and the Christian Institute. So we had that event. And our main concern at that time, I would say, was that we were concerned about explicit and intrusive content in the sex education curriculum. We felt that quite a bit of the content was not age appropriate, and there was a kind of tendency within the Scottish Government to want to use schools as a platform for surveying young people's ideas about sex, which involved asking them quite explicit and intrusive questions about their private lives and about their family's values. So we held this conference. We had within it a session on gender. 2 days before the event was going to happen, I got a phone call from the venue saying that their trans allies and staff had refused to work at the event and that they were going to have to cancel. Luckily for us, a church stepped in. We had the event, about 100 people. It was fantastic, and the reason it was fantastic is it's the first, you got a really strong sense of relief that people thought that this is the first time they'd had an opportunity to go into a public space and discuss their anxieties about what their children were being taught at school. Other than this space, they had not been able to articulate their fears and anxieties because they thought that they would be dubbed bigots. And so it was a great event. About 100 people turned up, just under 100 people. It was reported in the press by some of the papers and the Humanist Society, who described it as a festival of hate, which is a bit depressing, that we felt that we had really made a difference by providing this opportunity for discussion. Anyway, since then, we've had a lot of contact from parents and some teachers, although most teachers prefer to remain anonymous. But we have found that still, despite the fact that we're producing a weekly newsletter cataloguing people's stories about what's going on, still, when you talk to the media or when you talk to colleagues within the university sector and in other environments, we're often told that the examples that exist of the trans nursery school teacher who's encouraging very young children to believe that they might be born in the wrong body, or any other examples of problems where ideology is being introduced to very young children. These are one-offs. These are the exceptions. This is what we're told. This is not the general rule. This is the exception. So we're really campaigning to make an effort to catalogue the ways in which policy and policy producers and the whole raft of non-government organisations that sit underneath the policymakers that are generating documents and going into schools and generating initiatives on the gender issue, the way they operate. So we're trying to expose how they operate. And the main way we're doing that is through a Substack. And we have found, please sign up to our Substack and then promote it to your friends. We found that over a period of time, we're starting to get quite a lot of support from teachers, and teachers indicating that they feel that they're not in a position to publicly oppose government policy. I mean, if you think about Scotland's reputation, it used to have a reputation for educational excellence. And one of the strong components of that idea, particularly in the post-war period, was that regardless of your social class and regardless of where you were geographically, whether you were in Orkney or the Borders, that you would be getting the same quality of excellent education. I'm afraid we have to report that that's no longer the case, that kind of sense of universal education doesn't any longer exist. It doesn't exist for a number of reasons. The main reason it doesn't exist is that in 2010, the Scottish Government, at that point Labour, introduced something called the Curriculum for Excellence, which is not excellent and doesn't have any relationship to excellence. But that curriculum really put an end to the idea of knowledge-based learning and instead derided knowledge and subject teaching in favour of experience, self-esteem, well-being, which is the buzzword that appears in all documents, and also child-centred learning. Our concern was now with the whole child. And concern with the whole child meant that you didn't didactically pass on knowledge from one generation to another. What you did was that you appreciated the complexity of the conditions in which the child lived, and as a consequence of that, you elevated their personal experience at the centre point of the education system. The second reason why we've seen a massive decline in the quality of education, and this is reflected in PISA reports, it's not just my prejudice, is that the Scottish Government has increasingly seen children, our children, as a tool for the transformation of Scottish society. In fact, I wouldn't think that I'm overstating it to say Scots are undergoing one of the most aggressive and philistine social engineering projects in the history of the United Kingdom at this very moment. And in order to understand this, there's lots of things we could talk about, but I'm just going to very quickly talk about the transgender issue, and we have a pamphlet on the stall that relates to that. There is a raft of legislation that the Scottish Government has produced both in education and outside education, which strengthens my point. You only have to look at the named person, the hate crime bill, the smacking ban, and the gender reform recognition to kind of understand the modus operandi of the Scottish Government. But if you look at RHSP, which is the social personal education, and the policy on transgender, I think you begin to understand how Scottish education operates. It's not the only issue that we campaign on. We campaign on a number of issues. We have Muslim parents contacting us, complaining that anti-racist initiatives are driving pupils apart. And we have mums contacting us saying that their children have come home from school petrified because they're being taught environmental catastrophe as if it's an absolute given fact. But this question of the rights of transgender staff and children is the one in which you can see most clearly the direction of travel. So if you look at the guidance, which we've looked at in detail on this question, the guidance promotes the idea that in a situation where a child is wishing to socially transition, that the role of the school is to affirm that decision. It says that parents should be informed, but it also says that parents should not be informed if they're likely to oppose the process of transition. It uses old and inappropriate data from research in Canada to support the idea that affirming a child's desire to transition is the only way forward, and not affirming a child's desire to transmission can lead to suicide. So it's using a sort of moral anxiety, if you like, in order to promote the idea that social transitioning is something that must be affirmed. Finish? Or no. 1 minute? Yeah. I've met with more than a dozen parents distraught and distressed because they found themselves in a situation which they would describe as like living in a Margaret Atwood novel. In other words, they see something that's happening to their children that's being encouraged and affirmed by the school, at which they have no recourse. And Simon would tell you that if you look at the push that's coming in Scotland for policy on conversion therapy, that this process in which we're not allowed to talk to our children about the question of whether they are living in their own body or not is becoming stronger by the day, and that tendency is becoming stronger by the day. This week, we had a situation in which The Sun printed a story about a trans woman who was doing teacher training in a nursery school in Pollokshields in Glasgow. This story came to the attention of the press because Sue had found out about it through parents, and we wrote an article about it. We wrote an article explaining the complexity and difficulty and the responsibility of local government to decide what should be done in this situation, because parents were distraught, because children were coming home worried. The response by the media was to say that this person was driven out of their role because they felt unsafe. And I think these situations in Scotland really indicate the necessity of us finding mechanisms to open up the space to discuss these things properly in public.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Agnes, please.
Hello. My views on indoctrination in schools is just based on the schools I've gone to. And the first two I went to, it might be relevant. They were in the countryside. I don't associate them with any particular views. I don't think they influenced us to think anything in particular. And then I went to a third school in Sheffield, and I do associate that school with a whole range of views, the ones you would call woke views. And the students in those schools, I think, did definitely have different views. I can't tell how much it's to do with the school or the city they lived in, but everyone knew the concepts of unconscious bias, racism, systemic racism, microaggressions. I think it was largely to do with the fact the school had an aim to become the first anti-woke school, anti-racist school in the country, so they felt they needed to teach us about all of these different concepts in order to achieve that, because to be anti-racist, you can't just not be racist and not talk about it. You have to expect there to be loads of stuff even if you can't see it. But the main thing I'm interested in is not the school in general, but what it was like studying A-level English in particular at that school, because I thought that the students who took A-level English, their views were very, very distinctly changed or affected by studying the subject. And I think that's ultimately the cause of the mark scheme, actually, because to get marks, basically, you have to talk about either the texts or a set of theories called literary theories, like, for example, Marxism, feminism, post-colonialism. They're all about one group of people oppressing another group of people. And to get marks, you have to write about these theories in your essays. So from the teacher's point of view, I think, they're like, well, we want to get you to understand these views. We also have these views. So that they have no disincentive to make us understand these views, share these views, hold these views. And theoretically, the crux of it is you are supposedly capable of getting marks through disagreeing with these views in your essays. So you can write about the text and then supposedly use the text to disprove the theory, and then that way you'll have written about both to get marks. But in actual practice, no one ever tried. I disagree with the theories, I've never tried. You just have to pretend to agree with the theories. And it creates an environment where the teachers are encouraging you to believe in these theories. You're encouraged to write as though you believe in these theories. No one would ever consider disagreeing. Like, supposedly you could, I don't know how you would to get marks. And I have only realised that I disagree with these theories and come to feel confident about what I feel about it outside of the lesson. Because in the lesson I feel like everyone has these views, they've been introduced to these views in the same way by the teacher. To have my own more individual take on what I think of the literary theories, I had to go outside the lesson. On the train home, I would think about them. But I think that I'm the exception. Everyone else that I know would call themselves Marxist feminists, post-colonialists. And also, it doesn't just influence your views on the literary theories, but the literary theories hold political takes on things. So the literary theories, particularly Marxism, is anti-capitalist. And most people in my class, I should have asked or done a survey on it, but I'm pretty sure most people in my English class would have called themselves anti-capitalists, just because of taking the subject, I think. So this is what I'm most concerned about. I think you could simply change it by changing the mark scheme so that it doesn't value these views more than any other views, because it's very hard to write about them through disagreeing with them.
Thank you very much. Ruth, please.
Hello, I wasn't sure which microphone to use because they were both sort of equidistant when I sat down. Good afternoon, and thanks to everyone for being here. It's really great to see so many people interested in discussing this, what I think is a really crucial topic. In my remarks, I'm primarily going to be focusing on indoctrination as actually, I think, a disputed concept in philosophy of education within the analytic tradition. But in the broader discussion, I'll also try and draw on my experience working with Humanists UK, so there may be some disagreement, a charity advocating for non-indoctrinatory education that's inclusive of all children, irrespective of their religion or belief background. So I think we should begin by defining our terms. So the meaning of indoctrinate has actually really evolved over time. So initially it was a very neutral word meaning simply to teach. It only really took on negative connotations in the 20th century, and actually the first dictionary definition listing it as a pejorative term wasn't until 1934. Nowadays, I think accusations of indoctrination are pretty pervasive, not only in schools, but in other aspects of life, from the media to literature and online communities, of course. But I think the term is often misapplied and actually quite often used by people just to criticise the transmission or teaching of content that they disagree with. To understand indoctrination, we must first recognise that it is a form of teaching aimed at instilling beliefs. That's as distinct from behaviours, feelings, or attitudes. So analytic philosophers of education largely do agree on those two criteria. First, that indoctrination is a form of teaching, and that the teaching involved is teaching for belief. If we're trying to change people's behaviour or their feelings, that's conditioning. But because education is also going to involve legitimate teaching for belief, there's an ongoing debate over which additional criteria are necessary or sufficient to the term. So the main contenders for that are method, content, intention, and outcomes. So unsurprisingly, supporters of the method criterion suggest that specific teaching methods characterise indoctrination, but that view's pretty problematic, as certain non-reflective methods are going to be appropriate in certain contexts. So think about learning times tables or French verbs, for example. You don't need to do that reflectively. Supporters of the content criteria maintain that indoctrination involves teaching particular kinds of beliefs that we might call doctrines, so things like religion, politics. But even doctrines encompass both well-established facts alongside disputed beliefs. So virtually all scholars of antiquity agree that Jesus existed, even if it's an open question whether or not he was actually the Son of God. Some theorists emphasise the teacher's intentions, but that obviously excludes unintentional indoctrination, and I think, in my view, many individuals pass on unverified or unverifiable beliefs because they themselves have been indoctrinated. They don't intend their pupils to have unshakable beliefs that they hold irrespective of evidence. They just have misread the veracity of the evidence themselves. So I argue that indoctrination must be defined by its outcome. It might be more likely when teaching controversial subjects because of their disputed truth status, but it isn't conceptually confined to those issues. You can indoctrinate anything. It's about how you hold the belief. And indoctrination occurs when the beliefs one forms as a result of teaching are separated from the evidence or reasons for holding them, because you've been manipulated through fear or charm or pretense to hold those beliefs. It makes those beliefs unquestionable, or at the very least very resistant to revision, and that's what makes indoctrination dangerous. As the philosopher John Wilson says, "For here we have taken over or put to sleep a central part of the child's personality, his ability to think rationally in a certain area." We should also be aware we're all capable of indoctrination and of being indoctrinated, again, including with true beliefs. And to counter this, we've got to be prepared to subject our views to criticism, and we've got to revise them when new evidence comes along. When teaching topics about which reasonable people disagree, such as religion and politics, educators must be really cautious not to present a biased viewpoint, and that's really difficult, actually. I note that much of the current media attention on indoctrination at the moment is directed at political indoctrination, and religious indoctrination is actually permitted to take place unfettered in every school in England via say, a mandatory daily act of worship, which is supposed to be broadly and mainly Christian in character, and in many faith schools, in faith-based religious education. Not all faith schools, but many of them. We've got to remain vigilant against indoctrination whenever it arises, acknowledge its presence in our lives and challenge it when it's identified, and we can help to do this by promoting critical thinking, evidence-based learning, and creating an educational landscape which encourages openness, rationality, and a willingness to revise our beliefs in the face of new evidence. This is a really difficult task. But in the current climate of mass misinformation, we can't shy away from it. Thank you.
Thank you. Clive.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I've been teaching for about 32 years or so. Most of my teaching career, there's been a sort of broad consensus about what's considered moral or virtuous in society, I think, and amongst parents and amongst schools. But I've noticed, as we all have probably over the last few years, that's begun to change quite significantly. So, for example, I'm an RE teacher by trade, even though I'm a head teacher. And when we've ever looked at the issue of racism in RE, we always use, obviously, Martin Luther King as our example. And Martin Luther King's opposition to racism, based upon the idea that you should be judged by the content of your character and not the colour of your skin, which seemed uncontested and self-evident. And yet, as we know, more and more, we come across the assertion that someone's skin colour is the key way in which you might judge them, whether they're a victim or innately guilty. And that someone's character is secondary, which is sort of curious, to say the least, isn't it, really? So I'm going to explore just a couple of questions, just quickly in my section, perhaps practical questions based upon the fact I run a school. The first is looking at, should we actually teach moral or ethical behaviour to students? And I think that some of these ideas that have been spoken about already today, I think the schools are trying to help children to become more moral and ethical, but should we do that? And if we do think we should teach children to be ethical, how do we go about doing that in such a way that we're not indoctrinating, we're sort of taking out the political? So question number one, should we teach ethical and moral behaviour to pupils? Well, yes, I think we obviously should. It seems self-evident to me. I don't think children left to their own devices become moral or virtuous. Having taught for many years, if any of you are teachers, you know that children left to their own devices, you end up with Waterloo Road or Lord of the Flies. And that as parents and as educators, I think we need to explicitly teach what is moral and virtuous behaviour. In the same way, if you want children to understand and be able to solve quadratic equations, you need to explicitly teach them how to solve quadratic equations. In the same way, I think it's true for ethics. Children need to be taught how to be moral agents in the world. And this is perhaps, however, where it becomes more controversial. So, second question, can we teach moral behaviour without indoctrinating? I confess, as a head teacher of a secondary state school, if I could indoctrinate children to be hardworking, moral, immaculately behaved and charming, I would leap at the opportunity. I haven't been able to do that yet. But I do think that there are controversial ideas which are taught in schools. Obviously, organisations like Don't Divide Us have catalogued numerous examples. There are frequent examples on social media. We've heard some on the panel today. And I certainly, as a teacher, I see and hear about ideas which are taught in schools which just are grounded in postmodernist thinking about race or gender, and which are highly contested and contentious as well. So one of my issues with postmodernist movements and sort of identity politics, I think, is aside from being overtly political, is that as philosophical moral frameworks to be used in schools, they lack philosophical moral integrity. And what do I mean by that? Well, I'll give you an example. So part of my school's mission statement is the quote from Matthew Arnold, a 19th century educator. And he said that a key role of education is that children should learn about the best that has been thought and said. In other words, in my school, for example, in English, they'll learn about Homer and Chaucer and Shakespeare rather than Michael Morpurgo or Jacqueline Wilson, even if they might be brilliant authors or not, I don't know. When they study history, they'll study great figures of history and movements in history rather than make castles out of sponge cake or toilet rolls, which happens an awful lot in schools, believe it or not. So when it comes to moral framework, what could be the best that has been thought and said? What is integrity and authenticity? What would have great consent general consent in the wider community? Well, again, just going back to sort of my school, and lots of schools do this. We explicitly teach our pupils about the classical virtues. The virtues which include traits like temperance or self-control, fortitude, courage, prudence, sort of wise decision-making, justice, gratitude, and many others. Virtues are essentially habits that enable us to exhibit really worthwhile traits. The classical virtues, as opposed to some of the more controversial ideas that we've been talking about this afternoon, I think do have a pedigree and do have an integrity. Great thinkers from Plato to Aristotle to Kant and Descartes and many others have written about, thought deeply about, practiced and assessed the idea of virtue for thousands of years. The ideas have been tried and tested, explored and perfected. So with fortitude, for example, so we explicitly teach about fortitude in school. Children will learn what that fortitude means, it's sort of strength of character. We'll talk about being 10% braver. We'll talk to students about going out of their comfort zone, doing things that they require that inner sort of fortitude to be able to exhibit. Children are given opportunities to demonstrate strength of character. We have a merit system where you can get merits for showing fortitude or diligence or whatever it might be. And to quote Aristotle, we are what we repeatedly do. Excellence, then, is not an act, but a habit. If we practice virtue, eventually those virtues become habits, and these habits become part of our character. So I think the way virtues are taught, the way that certainly we teach virtues, is through exploring, unpicking, using reason to justify looking at the consequences in real-life situations. They have an internal logic and an integrity about them, and we're also incredibly transparent with parents about what we teach. I don't think some of the more controversial ideas mentioned this afternoon have that pedigree. Postmodernism and the ideas of Foucault or Derrida, for example, have influenced some of the movements, not only lack the longevity and integrity of their philosophical predecessors, but can be logically incoherent, and they are obviously highly contested. Amongst all the stakeholders in the school community, the vast majority would consider that being diligent, just, grateful, patient, compassionate, and so on, are generally noble aspirations. The same stakeholders, I would guess, would be less unanimous about considering the colour of someone's skin a key indicator of their victimhood or privilege, or consider that the reality of multiple genders is a scientific fact. And yet, I think interestingly, when I talk to older teenagers or young people who are sort of university age, I do see the acceptance of certain moral stances which fall into this category. And when they're questioned, even quite lightly questioned, they're unable to logically defend those positions and can even get quite upset even if you just question those ideas. So in conclusion, I think schools should explicitly teach children how to be moral. However, the foundation for that education needs to have integrity. It needs to be founded upon reason, the collective wisdom of generations, and we need to be very open about what we teach rather than the philosophical frameworks that can only be taught through assertion rather than reason. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good. Interesting introductions, and it raises lots of queries. So we're going out straight to the audience. Where are my mics?
It's really interesting with the ideology that we are talking about. That's
Can you stand up, please?
Oh yeah, stand up. Sorry, I keep forgetting to stand up. So the ideology that that some schools seem to be infected by, that we could call wokeism in a way. It's really interesting that and I think that's a big part of the problem. They see themselves as critically thinking. They see themselves as moral, even more so than the old, you mentioned the Athenian standard, going back to the old philosophers. And I think it comes out of this skepticism that came with postmodernism, skepticism to the old values and the old ideals, and then was sparked a sort of new anti-ideal. But I agree with you that I think the problem with that is it lacks any proper foundation itself. So often it leaves you in a bit of a nihilistic mess, and you don't really have any fundament to place yourself on. But I find it very difficult how to convince or persuade people that are taken up by that ideology that they're not necessarily being critically thinking or having a proper moral basis. Because the way I see the problem is they see themselves exactly as that, and they have a completely different paradigm. So if you try and argue with them, they're like, aha, you're using tactics of the old model. I won't be fooled by that. I won't be indoctrinated by you. So it's kind of like two outside groups trying to get at each other, but they don't speak the same language.
Hi. So this is kind of aimed at Agnes, I think your name is. I'm a film and English student English kind of comes first. I wanted to know what you actually make of the literary theories that you've just mentioned, because I don't understand, not trying to sound mean or rude, I don't understand how you could read Hamlet and Wuthering Heights and not think, okay, let's apply a feminist reading to this and I will gain something out of that. Like, even like Evan Millant's Ophelia is a feminist reading of Hamlet, and that is an 18th century watercolour painting. Like, these literary theories are accessible to A-level students, and that is why they are so widely taught, and often they are also very easily applicable to these texts. It is genuinely really easy, and I found this myself doing my English A-level, my English GCSEs, that doing a feminist reading of something or a Marxist reading of something, I wasn't just doing it because everyone else was saying, please do it. I was doing it because I legitimately thought, and I still do, think that this is a very good way to analyse these texts and to accept the context that they were written in. We live under capitalism, we have lived under patriarchy, you know.
Yeah, hello. I just wanted to say, isn't part of the problem with schools that schools are having to do so much that they get groups in from outside to come in and teach, and some of them are really quite dodgy. And also, there's such a culture, what I find with young people, that use this culture of being kind and inclusive rather than the values that you were talking about, which are much more, have to be much more thought and critical and sort of rigorous, really. There's a sort of laziness about it. You know, just be inclusive, accept this person. You know, the children's books, they've got a bow tie on, they put it on the head, now they're a little girl, they're not a little boy. Be kind.
Thank you. I think Clive said if children are left to their own devices, it turns into Lord of the Flies.
I was a bit hyperbole, it's not necessarily.
Wait a minute. They're not left to their own devices, are they? They've got parents. And it's in the family that children have always first learnt about virtue. And yes, schools would have played a role, and the church would have played a role, but it was in the family essentially. So now that we're seeing more and more family breakdown, is that changing the landscape and the role that schools need to play?
Hi, my father-in-law was a top civil servant in the Scottish office, which ran the affairs of Scotland before it fell into the hands of the SNP. And it was at that time producing excellence in education. I'm a product of that excellence. I went into a primary school class of 42. I was the only person from that class to go to university. So maybe that says something also about university entrance and so on. I taught for most of my career, and I understood that as a teacher I was in partnership not only with the pupil but also with the parent. So it never occurred to me not to inform a parent of what was the content of the curriculum and who was delivering it. I'm now a member of the Free Speech Union and supporting a parent who has been denied access, A, to the personal affairs aspect of the curriculum, and B, to the person, which is an outside agent person delivering it. I think that is abhorrent.
Just first of all, a response to the person who was asking Agnes about the readings, the feminist and Marxist readings of Hamlet or Wuthering Heights or what have you. I mean, you know, feel free, get on. But the thing that is most depressing, and I say this as somebody who both was an English literature student and taught English literature for many years, is that what's lost in this is a literary reading of the literature. I mean, you know, I don't care what your theories are. What do you think of the book? What do you think of the poem? What do you think? Give me a literary interpretation of the great art involved. And I'm afraid that many of the students that I latterly taught and many of the students I encounter today when I'm talking around universities are indifferent to, indeed hostile to literature based on a feminist or Marxist critique. I mean, you know, I'm an old Marxist, right? But you can read a book and not go, as a Marxist, let me study this. Because what you're doing is, you're not enjoying the literature. And in fact, you develop disdain and disgust and contempt for the great works of literature, because you're only seeing it through what, frankly, are superficial. I mean, you made the point, you know, If you read these things and don't notice that women are being treated badly, you're an idiot. You don't need feminist studies or a feminist reader, right? That's a whole layer of theoretical nonsense added on that wastes time. Because actually, if you've got time, you should be reading more books, more plays and more poems, not more theories. Anyway, got that off my chest. I was actually standing up to speak to Ruth, or to ask Ruth a question. I suppose my interest in the indoctrination thing, as an atheist now, but who was educated in a Catholic school, I felt that the Catholic education, Catholic comp that I went to, the Catholic education I got was the first time that I was really made to think philosophically and morally about the questions of the day. It was never, ever introduced to me as there was plenty of dogma in my house and going to church, don't get me wrong, you know, that's what Catholics are like. But actually, in a Catholic schooling setting, it didn't affect the marks I got. So the point that Agnes makes was I didn't have to do a Catholic reading of Hamlet, right? It didn't ever mean I was going to get less of a mark. And so I do feel that today's secular religions, as it were, that are being described particularly well, I thought, by Penny at the beginning, you know, there's no room for discussion or debate. Whereas all that religious education was while I was at school was debate and so on. That was all we did. Now, we did have to learn, you know, the Hail Mary and the Our Father, and maybe that's the same as learning the language of pronouns and white privilege and so on. But the irony was that our punishment was actually far into the future. Hell. What we've got now is the punishment is hell on earth today. Right? So give me Catholicism any day. That's my
We'll take one more question and then we bring it back to the panel for very short comments. Can I also just take Ruth up here on something she said? Because you kind of said, like, an accusation of indoctrination today often means that we just disagree with something. And I would like to challenge you on that, really, because, you know, ideas like white privilege and critical race theory, I think it is not just disagreeing, it is actually indoctrination because they don't allow the criticism. But that's maybe something we can come back to.
I'm a retired teacher, retired RE teacher and head teacher. And I just want to address a little bit the indoctrination. Because I did studies in RE, we were really concerned about indoctrination. So Ormsby Smith, a sociologist, did quite a lot of research on this. And he found that being a Catholic, if you're in a Catholic school, because of the drop-off rate, an example is there, that was just obvious proof, statistical proof, that the kids weren't indoctrinated. But he found a couple of qualities about being in a Catholic school. One was you were less likely to get divorced later on in life, so whatever your relationship, it lasted longer, whether you were married or not. And secondly, it's the only of all the religions to have less suicide. But on the other side, if you're a male, you're more likely to end up in prison statistically. And if you're a female, you're more likely, if you're a Catholic, to be a prostitute. So that's the statistical analysis for that. But going back to the head teacher, I think I've not heard it said so succinctly. If you want to teach algebra, you can't just assume that people will get algebra. You can't assume they'll get it at all. You can't assume that people will think rationally, because modern society show that people don't think rationally. Teach it. Teach virtue. In the Catholic schools, we had hell, obviously, but we had the Ten Commandments, and we had to love God. And I used to start all my lessons off with a prayer, and so that shut them up. So they came in quietly. But just to finish off, I just want to say, let's get the cojones to teach virtue, because that's the one thing that's missing is teaching virtue and rational thought. And the last school I worked in was, the motto on the badge was, having been warned, seek justice. And seek justice is what we should be doing.
Thank you. We bring it back to the panel. Penny first, and we go in that order.
Okay, somebody raised a question about the family, and I do think, it was you, wasn't it? I mean, I do think there are real structural changes in society that are a consequence of the breakdown of the family, but I suppose the question is, what's the role of school in that context? And well, one thing is particularly on the gender issue, I think where you have got broken families, schools are actually setting parents against each other. So I talked about distraught parents. Most of those distraught parents happen to be men who were in divorced families who had a different opinion from their wives about whether their children should be encouraged to transition or persuaded that it may not be what they really want to do. And I think schools feel this, in Scotland certainly feel this sense that they have some kind of moral authority which allows them to intervene and make judgments about the parents being right or wrong. And that is a problem, particularly among young guidance teachers, that they kind of have this thing that Bruno described as a sense of moral superiority that comes through teacher training. So in that sense, yes, I wouldn't want to say changes in the family aren't significant, but I don't think the way schools are dealing with it is helping. And I do think there's a broader culture which is based on this idea that education is not about knowledge, is about child well-being, which is a shift, a very, very significant shift, which means that young teachers overreach all of the time and think that their role is to boost the self-esteem of the child rather than understanding that education is, imparting knowledge is part of the process of giving a child the resources to deal with life, not that their role is to help children deal with life. So I think that distinction is really important. Just one final point on the General Teaching Council. So in Scotland, things are particularly bad because most of our institutions that operate outside direct government, the civil society institutions like the General Teaching Council, have no independence. I don't know whether you want to use the word captured or not, but they operate to the same agenda as government. So we don't really have any opposition, and the Labour Party is completely useless, and the Tories are pretty useless too. So that means that the General Teaching Council, who used to have policy guidance for teachers so they understood their moral obligations, which used to be fairness and objectivity and these kind of issues, has now been redefined, and the core value that you as a teacher trainee must swear allegiance to is social justice. So that's now at the core of what you describe as the professional status of a teacher. And I think that is very significant. And we kind of need to roll back on that to redefine what teaching is again.
Good, perfect, thank you.
Yes. In response to the question about the English theories, well, the English theories, they tell you to look at something as a woman, which wouldn't be a problem really. But what I don't like is they imply what they think a woman would think. So English theories, they're associated with a lot of other theories about ways of thinking. So I don't actually agree with a lot of their ideas about feminism, despite being a woman. So for example, one of the things they say is femininity is a social construct, which might be to an extent, but I think it's a real thing. And there are loads of other examples. Like they say capitalism, it says it reifies people, which means Marxism suggests that we view each other as objects, and I don't think we do, because of the commerciality of how businesses view people as objects, essentially, so they can do jobs. And it suggests we're a product of our environment, and I think it suggests it too far. I think we're more like in the nature and nurture. It suggests a whole load of views, which sometimes I agree with, sometimes I disagree with, more often I disagree with. But the annoying thing is I essentially have to pretend to agree with these views to get marks. I think that's it.
Good, thank you.
Yeah, so I'll start with your criticism Ruth. I think you're right in the sense that ultimately, because the theory of indoctrination that I endorse is one that's based on this idea of holding your beliefs apart from the evidence and reasons for having them, that anything can be indoctrinated, right? That makes life very difficult for teachers, because even if you're trying to pass on something which everybody agrees is true, there is a possibility that you could get your pupils to hold it in a non-critical fashion that would be problematic. So that means that when we're doing things like trying to pass on virtue, on the one hand, I think you're right. I don't think we can avoid that. I think that it's inescapable, right? If we try to avoid it, that in and of itself is a form of moral education, right? So we're still doing some moral education. But we do need to think when we're teaching virtues, okay, are we debating these virtues? Are we looking at the benefits? Could there be any downsides? Is fortitude always positive? I mean, I don't know if you're teaching it along the kind of golden mean line, but, you know, perhaps there's a virtue in knowing where to quit sometimes. So we need to equip children and young people with the ability to, in a sense, question everything. But the difficulty is that we also need to give them knowledge to get started on. And that is sometimes going to involve some kind of directive teaching. But as long as you're prepared to kind of have those discussions, I think that's the best way to try and avoid indoctrination. Can I very quickly just pick up on what Claire was saying about her Catholic school? The thing to say is that no two schools are alike. And there are some Catholic schools out there doing very good practice in this area and doing lots of debate and discussion. And there are others teaching using, for example, RSE resources that say things like women are receiver-responders and men are initiators in sexual relationships. Their brains are different. Women will get more attached after sex. The pill is a moral danger and should be avoided. It's a physical danger as well. And they're teaching these in order to enhance the probability that the children and young people become Catholic. And that's what I have a problem with, those gaps in the law that allow things like that to happen. So, of course, if people are teaching other aspects of the curriculum in that unquestioning way, that's problematic. But it's also problematic if it's happening with religion, and it is happening with religion.
Thank you. Clive?
So just following on from that point, and to my fellow head teacher and to Claire as well, I've been teaching Catholic RE for 32 years. I haven't been able to indoctrinate anybody yet. I might just be a rubbish RE teacher, I don't know. Going to the point that you made about children being left to their own devices and that moral education. I mean, most parents, certainly in my school, are great and sort of do a hugely beneficial role in terms of raising their children. But there are lots of dysfunctional families, and there are families that we meet on a sort of a weekly basis that are sort of anti-role models and that are incredibly ineffective. And I mean, there are stories I could tell you just from, which I mean, my school's a lovely school, but of parents who have done the most atrocious things, and the children, because they've had virtue education, will come literally the next day and apologise and say, I'm sorry, sir, that my parent did this or my mum did this, which is an indicator that they've had that moral education. And in terms of school, I mean, about being explicit, one of my daughters, she's teaching, she's a teacher, and she's doing lots of supply work in London at the moment. And some of the stories that she tells me on a daily basis, where children in these schools are practically feral, where they're incredibly cruel to other children, they're incredibly cruel to teachers. So I think schools need to take up that slack. And so if there is an issue with families, but certainly as an instrument in society, they need to be very, very explicit about how we enable children to become virtuous and moral in their lives.
Thank you. We'll take some more questions in a minute, but I'm just making an exception, and Agnes is going to say something else.
Oh, I forgot to add, the reason why we study the literary theories, it might be really hard to understand from an outsider's point of view, but all of our teachers have the best intentions. They want to give a voice to the voiceless, which is what the theories are supposed to do. Like feminism, women were always historically oppressed, the poor were oppressed, so that's their intention, to give you a better understanding. But the thing that annoys me about that is because I'm a woman and, well, if I'm voiceless, I don't actually agree with what they say the voiceless believe. So, for example, do the poor really believe they're a product of their environment? Did Marx go up to a poor person and say, are you a product, why are you unhappy? And they say, I'm a product of my environment. I don't think that actually happened. It's, what they are is they're what some academics thought was good for some voiceless people, and what some academics thought ages ago. So, for example, they would never be anything to do with, like, Brexit, for example. Some people would argue is the biggest modern example of voicelessness in England. So that's the reason why we study them, because they want to help us understand the voices who are oppressed. But I still don't think that actually helps us understand whoever is oppressed, assuming you know who they are.
Good. So here, please, and then...
There's a very good book I recommend you, written in the 1960s, called The Pupils. And it was a bit of fun. It goes through poo and just analyses it from a Marxist point of view, a postmodern point of view, a feminist point of view. That was a joke then. It's now become a literary standard. I think there's been a lot of talk, apart from Clive and Penny, and there's a lot of talk about indoctrination, but not much about knowledge. And take a slightly Socratic view of it, knowledge is a virtue. It's not something we want for something else, it's an end in itself, and it's a hard end. Right? And I think you have to go to the heart of what's happened. I used to be involved in a free school where they didn't have behaviour, they had scholarly behaviour. So all the behaviours were to enable you to learn and to think and get that knowledge that you really needed to make you a human being. That's what it was about, and take you out of your local and introduce you to the world of literature. A fantastic idea. But you're really, in a way, just dealing with symptoms. And once the education system has abandoned the commitment to knowledge, we can track it in philosophy of education, you can track it in the history of policy, but particularly in teacher training, where you would never even get a job if you were committed to knowledge-based education. So you have a whole generation and 2 generations of teachers who not only are against knowledge, they despise it. They're a sloppy sort of relativism, which philosophers could actually challenge, is everywhere. And it's never challenged. So I think there's a real issue there for people to deal with. And once you've emptied knowledge out of education, any old rubbish can go in. Right? Therapeutic education is my bête noire, but any sort of system, and teachers do it because they don't know what to teach. They get enthusiastic about everything. You can track it, mindfulness, whatever it is. They'll do it because they've forgotten what the purpose of education is, which is to introduce people, to, as Clive said, the best from Matthew Arnold, the best that's been known and thought.
Thank you. We'll have this person there and then in the front. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. The question is it Agnes?
Put it close to your mouth.
Sorry, is it Agnes or Agnes?
Agnes.
Agnes. Okay. And so it's a response to Claire's point. What you're describing, being presented by very full-form theories from Marxism and feminism and so on, and pupils are told, well, but you're free to sort of take another point of view. Of course, how can they compete with such elaborate views? And I've seen this happen at tertiary level as well. But I wonder if you'd been presented by alternative and competing theories which contest those sorts of views, and you have a range of views with none of them presented as necessarily being authoritative. Would that possibly facilitate the process of people's being able, and I know it would get into sort of meta-theory as well, but the possibility that they then would feel freer, or even feel the responsibility to have to make some decisions, not just go with what seems like the common wisdom. And just very quickly, to Claire's point, it seems like what you're describing is saying, whether looking from Marxist feminist point of views or looking at literary points of view, that seems like a sort of dichotomy between content and style. And on one hand, I'm wondering, cannot style also have a whole political aspect to it? But conversely, can't we think of examples where the two things are at cross purposes? We could think an undeniably white supremacist film would be Birth of a Nation. It's got Ku Klux Klan members as heroes, but is it possible still to believe that that's actually got many important cinematic qualities? And conversely, some worthy films might be pretty crap cinema.
Okay, so one of the nice things about being in a group full of people who actually believe that language is about communicating is also get the opportunity to share things. And just 2 things struck me that I'd like to share. One is the thing about parents in schools. People who know me know I work a lot in education. And I worked in a school a few years ago where the head said to me, biggest problem I've got, Joe, is I don't know who's parenting these children from one day to the next. Now, that wasn't Moss Side, it wasn't East London, it was Oxford. And another thing, Penny, I led the team of educationalists that put the GLOW project into Scotland. So I sat across the desk from the people who started the Curriculum for Excellence. From day one, it was the most overtly politicised thing I've ever seen. It should be binned tomorrow. And that leads me to the third thing, which is, in the first session, I was really struck by the idea that we need to think about what we want to do. And so I've decided, this day's been useful for me because it's made me decide what I want to do. I would love to see comprehensive education binned tomorrow, because comprehensive education was when the door was open to politicise schools. They became political projects, and everything that's been said today has demonstrated, in this session, has demonstrated that for me.
It goes back to what a few of the other people were saying. Schools today, most of them, they're not students. They're turning these kids into activists. That's the goal. Now, this poison has come over from America, and it breaks my heart because it has taken over, and it is sweeping this great country. And the schools in America, these departments of education where these teachers come from, they are hotbeds of this activism. It has nothing to do with education. And these universities, these American universities, need to be burned to the ground. Because I'm not even kidding, because it's too late. It's too late for these schools. And that's why they've started this University of Austin in Texas, where I'm from, to try and salvage these teachers that have gotten drummed out. But I'm telling you, if this country doesn't get it together, and more head teachers like you, which I applaud for what you're doing, this country, it's going to be lost, and these kids are going to hate. They hate this country. They're going to hate their parents, and it's a catastrophe. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks for that. I think I heard something spoken recently where a man was talking about his young daughter. And he said, what I wanted to, when she grows up, I want her to be whatever she wants to be. And I thought about that it was the cruelest thing I've ever heard a parent say about their child. Because one of the duties we have as parents and teachers combined is to tell our children what has worked through history. And I think it's the Matthew Arnold quote. That's what that really is about, to get the collective of what works in terms of a long life, a secure life, a socially acceptable life, what has worked. Now, some of those things will be indoctrination. There will be no real, well, there'll be some facts that you could provide statistics, but that there would be some factual basis as to what has worked. And that should be, to me, that's the objective.
Good, we're going to bring it back to the panel for very, very, very short comments, and then we go out again to the audience.
Okay.
Just very brief.
Very brief. We could have another discussion about universities, I think. Terrible, terrible situation in universities. But I think what you were describing in terms of different viewpoints being put, and that's really what universities should be doing. They're just not doing it at the moment. I mean, I think I really agree with Claire that at a secondary school level, you're introducing to the discipline. And that really demands a love of the discipline. And for a teacher, it kind of demands a little bit, if it's literature, a love of the world as well. Because I think that if you approach that with a very misanthropic viewpoint, which a lot of teachers are doing at the moment, and a very pessimistic viewpoint about humanity, it's quite hard to carry children with you on why you should be enjoying literature and sharing the experiences of the people that have written it. And I think we should try and reinvigorate that sense of literature rather than it being about critical thinking. I think we should just take that idea of critical reflection out of schools, because it kind of course, young women of this age are thinking critically about things, but when you start to teach it, without having taught the basics, it becomes something completely meaningless, I think.
Thank you. Maybe?
Oh, I totally agree with the person who said if you study a range of theories that don't obviously agree with each other, then that's fine, because they will, I don't think if they disagree with each other, then you are aware of the counter arguments. You have more of an ability to make your own decision. Like, that's not quite the same. I don't think that's not the case with the literary theories we have at the moment, because there are all sorts of overlaps with them. Like, they, for example, saying you're a product of your environment leads to believing that femininity is a social construct. Marxism believes that capitalism is terrible. It's mentioned in most of the other literary theories, like in eco-criticism, it even says that Marxism is worse for the environment than any other system because it views resources in terms of whether you can earn money and has no sort of spiritual value of things. So they are all linked. They do tend to agree with each other. I think you could teach theories in English without indoctrinating people, but they should be chosen because they are interesting, rather than because they give the voice to the voiceless or any slightly political view. And ideally, they counter each other.
Good, leave it to that. Good point. Ruth.
I wanted to pick up on the point about autonomy as an educational aim being whatever you want to be. Now, I think maybe in a ham-fisted way what this person was trying to say was that they wanted their child to live their life from the inside, to make choices for themselves. That doesn't mean that we can't guide our children, and it doesn't mean that we can't teach them the best of what has been thought and said. Knowledge is a key component of autonomy. How can you make good choices if you don't have any knowledge? So I think what we really want for our children is for them to flourish, but we need to recognise that living your life from the inside, being autonomous, is a key factor in that, and indoctrination harms that ability.
Just picking up Dennis's point about knowledge, which I think you're quite right, and I think that certainly over my years of teaching, some of the most pointless things we've done have been the antithesis of that. So if you're teachers, if you've heard of VAC and PLTs and learning styles, and a whole range of things that you do and we did with enthusiasm, and then discovered that there was no research evidence to base those theories on, and then they were dumped soon after that, were the knowledge-rich education, which, I mean, the virtues idea that we use comes from that, having that depth and that integrity to what we have in schools. So yeah, absolutely agree with Dennis.
Good, thank you. So we're taking a few more questions. I might not be able to take everybody, but we'll try. Please.
Thank you. I wanted to respond to the gentleman who said that we should get rid of comprehensive schools, with a slight note of caution, as much as I have some sympathy with that as a parent of a child in the independent sector is very much at the forefront of critical social justice and very much indoctrinating children. I am not an educator, I am merely a parent, but from my point of view, we can discuss at length what indoctrination means, but put very simply, I think we've moved from teaching children how to think to teaching them what to think. And I was very struck by what Agnes had to say, because she came up with some practical solutions, i.e. have a look at the exam board, see what they're actually going to question you at, or how the marks are structured. And I would say as a parent, I've gone from feeling very reverential about teachers teaching in schools to feeling extremely cynical. And I would just say to every parent in this room and every grandparent, please pay very close attention to what your children, your grandchildren, your nieces and nephews are being taught. And if you don't like it, make a fuss about it. Go into school and make a fuss about it. I've done that, and it's actually been reasonably successful. Not wholly successful, but we've had a few victories in my son's school. So I would just say, you've got to be an activist parent now.
Go to the back and then here, and please, very, very brief, so that we get as many people in as possible.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, as a parent as well, I think I've got no problem with children being taught belief, and they should be exposed to as many beliefs as possible. But what teachers are getting wrong is they don't know what is a belief and what isn't. So transgender ideology, for example, which is a belief, is being taught as fact in our schools, and that is indoctrination. If it was taught as a belief system, I would kind of handle a 1-hour lesson on it, but not as indoctrination.
I just wanted to say something to Ruth regarding indoctrination, and perhaps introduce the rather radical idea that there may be some values that are better than others, that we have descended into a sort of vague relativism in terms of teaching children values and concepts that, well, in terms of religious values, I'm speaking to this gentleman here, I feel that we can say that some value systems are preferable or better for society than others. I know this is radical, and I don't mind being argued with, but, you know, I'd just like to introduce that when we're talking about indoctrination. We can indoctrinate.
Please.
Thank you so much. I have many questions, but I will ask one. The one that bothers me the most at this point in time. I am a parent of a trans-identified young person, and when we look into gender identity policies in schools, we all know that Department of Education hasn't provided formal guidance that schools could follow, and that's unfortunate and not quite right. But in the absence of this formal guidance, which schools would you say are strong models and in doing the right thing?
I think, as a head teacher, we get a certain perspective on the influence our schools have, and I think schools are incredibly, obviously, powerful institutions in any society, in any community, and are very, very influential. Therefore, I think those of us in education have a really sort of grave and serious role to play. Therefore, this is why, sort of just reiterating my argument, I think that we have to focus on the best that's been thought and said, to focus on knowledge, to focus on ideas and concepts and strategies that have that integrity and that depth and that wisdom of ages. And that if schools can do this, if schools can enable children to become well-educated, highly knowledgeable, very rounded, moral, ethical young people, then I think we're doing the job that we should be doing. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Chris?
I just want to pick up quickly on what you were saying. I agree that there are going to be some values which are more valuable than other kinds of values. We might disagree on what they are. However, this is a kind of ongoing argument in the philosophy of education about whether there is such a thing as good indoctrination versus bad indoctrination. And what I would say is, if the values are genuinely better, or if the reasons are genuinely better, expose children to those reasons, and then they should adopt those values. Don't think that you have to engineer it that they accept those values. Give them the reasons and make sure that they hold those values for the right kinds of reasons.
Thank you very much. Agnes?
I should stress that the first two schools I went to, I didn't think they influenced the students in any way. So I think people can end up being too cynical about this. It was just English and the third school I went to that annoyed me. And also, I would add, I totally agree that values, I would argue that some are better than others. But I also agree that they're really valuable. And people keep talking about knowledge. I think people still teach knowledge. But anyway, values and knowledge and culture, I still think they're really important, like Clive said. And I also agree that they could be used to indoctrinate, like Ruth said. So I think it would be good if we just taught them taught a lot of culture and values in RE in the context of a debate. And then that's the way you get taught them.
Great point about the debates. Yes, Penny.
I feel very sympathetic towards teachers because we've been talking about one aspect of things. They're under a lot of pressure from different directions. I think what you were describing at the beginning is really a tendency for teachers to teach to the test. And my own children are evidence of that I've tried to discuss and encourage them to get engaged in reading different books around subject. And they've told me that they don't want to do that because it actually is a barrier to their success in school to look at literature outside that is determined as the right literature. And that's a very sad situation. A lot of teachers would probably say they're teaching to the test because they're under a lot of time pressure and that they feel overloaded and stressed and all of those different things. So I feel that we need a campaign against teach to the test as well as the ideology. But on the trans ID issue, I don't know of any schools that I would say have dealt with this well in Scotland because I think they're dealing with it really badly. But if I was a head teacher, I think I would say this is not the role of the school to affirm or not affirm a child's identity. That's for the parents and, if necessary, psychiatric support. But regardless of that, why not do what we've always done, which is call children by their name? And if we call children by their name and we can agree on what their name is, then we don't really need to worry too much about the definition of what their gender is. And I think that would be a really good policy if we went with the name that appeared on the register when they registered at the school. It would get rid of a lot of problems, and I'm really against school children being forced to recognise a changed pronoun of another child. I think that's really problematic.